Welcome back to Classical Mythology. This is part one of Module 6, where we will be looking at another pairing of gods, Hestia and Hermes. Before we get into that, we will just look back at some of the major issues that we've dealt with in recent weeks. I think it's important to think about each of the myth stories that we are looking at from week to week serves as a kind of case study for the various interpretive frameworks and methodologies that we're learning about. For example, Hesiod's cosmogony was a good example to apply Malinowski's idea of functionalism, the discussions we had of Zeus and Hera were connected to Doniger's implied spider. Demeter and Hades allowed us to see myth as reinforcing social norms. And when we looked at the figure of Aphrodite, we saw how myths could be used in a more subversive way in the face of prevailing social norms. I also talked about this idea of the universal goddess to which Aphrodite is closely connected, and how numerous goddess figures were absorbed into a singular kind of universal deity through the Hellenistic and Roman periods. So this led to the idea of a single divine power that is known by many different names, whether it's Aphrodite, Demeter, Ishtar, or Isis. And I think this process itself can be read as a kind of form of subversion on a cosmic level, because devotees of the universal goddess were seeking freedom from fate and destiny, which was perceived by many people to be an all-powerful force in their lives, but also on a social level, because the goddess was seen to be the patroness of people who were suffering and dispossessed. We saw that in the hymn to Isis. And there's a certain irony in the fact that in such a highly patriarchal ancient society as we see in both Greece and Rome, that a universal goddess figure would come to be seen as a sort of redeemer figure. So this is somewhat unexpected, but important to recognize. But I also want to emphasize the fact that there is actual theological content to these myth stories. We should assume that these stories were actually believed by the ancient people who told them and heard them, as much as they can illustrate for us from a modern perspective dynamics of society and political culture. They can be revealing of how Greco-Roman society functioned and power relations and ideology, etc. That doesn't diminish the fact that people in the Greco-Roman world thought that powerful gods were indeed at work in the cosmos. So I don't think we should reduce these myth stories simply to politics by other means, or just a window into social relations. They do illustrate those sorts of dynamics, but I think we should tend to avoid the sort of reductionist pitfall of seeing all myth and religion as simply social commentary. That's those sorts of dynamics would have been largely invisible to people immersed in the society. They are more transparent to us as modern outsiders. Now, the first deity we will look at today isn't one that is particularly well known, but Hestia is associated most closely with the household sphere. She is a virgin goddess of the hearth. In fact, the word Hestia in Greek means hearth. So this is the sacred fire at the center of the household, and it was around which the family gathered and performed domestic religious practices, a kind of ancient fireplace and cooking space. At the hearth, small offerings could be made to the gods of the household. And in the stories told about Hestia, many gods try to seduce her, but she vows to remain a virgin. This reflects the fact that the daughters of the household tended the hearth and were expected to maintain that social norm. Even in cities themselves, ancient city-states would have a central hearth of their own that needed to be maintained. For example, in the city of Rome, the hearth was maintained by the Vestal virgins. Vesta is the Roman name for Hestia, and they were understood as daughters of the city. So the city of Rome was imagined as a kind of macrocosm of the, or extension of the domestic household sphere. So in this sense, Hestia is a stable deity. She is local and kind of homebound, whereas Hermes, the other figure we'll look at in this part, is more mobile. He travels. He's a dynamic, kind of shape-shifting sort of figure. So for some scholars, Hestia is seen as a kind of polar opposite to Hermes. And this reflects another perspective, which is a more sort of structuralist interpretation of myth, which sees mythology as a kind of system with its own internal logic and dynamic. So each aspect needs a counter aspect, and each positive needs a negative. And another example of this would be the pairing of Apollo and Dionysus. This is something that a number of modern authors and thinkers have tried to do in kind of seeing their respective functions as representing civilization and chaos in a kind of creative, dynamic polarity. And we find references to Hestia in one of our go-to sources for ancient mythology. That's the Homeric hymns. In this case, it's a hymn to Aphrodite that contains a reference to Hestia. The poet says, "Nor yet does the pure maiden Hestia love Aphrodite's works. She was the firstborn child of wily Cronos, and youngest too, by will of Zeus who holds the Aegis. A queenly maid, whom both Poseidon and Apollo sought to wed, but she was wholly unwilling, nay, stubbornly refused. And touching the head of Father Zeus, who holds the Aegis, she, that fair goddess, swore a great oath, which has in truth been fulfilled, that she would be a maiden all her days." So this reflects this notion of Hestia's sacred virginity. So Zeus the father gave her high honor instead of marriage, and she has her place in the midst of the house and has the richest portion. In all the temples of the gods she has a share of honor, and among all mortal men she is chief of the goddesses. And these three Aphrodite cannot bend. Of these three Aphrodite cannot bend or ensnare their hearts. So in this passage we see Hestia, who, like I said, isn't particularly well known kind of outside of specialized discussions. Hestia is portrayed as a kind of elevated and powerful deity in the divine hierarchy. We also have a hymn to Hestia herself from the Homeric corpus. This one says, "Hestia in the high dwelling in the high dwellings of all, both deathless gods and men who walk on earth. You have gained an everlasting abode and highest honor. Glorious is your portion and your right. Again, she's portrayed in this elevated status. For without you, mortals hold no banquet, where one does not duly pour sweet wine in offering to Hestia both first and last. So this connects her back to the domestic sphere. That's where celebrations take place and social interaction in the household sphere. And you, Argefontes, this is one of the titles of Hermes, son of Zeus and Maia, be favorable and help us, you and Hestia, the worshipful and dear. So in this Homeric hymn itself, we see a pairing of these two deities in an interesting way. Come and dwell in this glorious house in friendship together, for you too, well knowing the noble actions of men, aid on their wisdom and their strength. Hail, daughter of Cronos, and also you, Hermes. So this association between Hesta and Hermes is not simply an invention of modern commentators, but was something that was recognized by ancient poets themselves. Finally, we have a Roman perspective on this goddess, who, like I said, is referred to as Vesta in Latin. This comes from Cicero's treatise on the nature of the gods. From the 1st century, he says the name Vesta comes from the Greeks, for she is the goddess whom they call Hestia. Her power extends over altars and hearths, and therefore all prayers and all sacrifices end with this goddess, because she is the guardian of the innermost things. Closely related to this function are the penates, or household gods of the Romans. So what's being pointed to here is the fact that Hestia, again, this kind of lesser known deity, has jurisdiction over some of the most important spaces in ancient life, both the center of the household, but also the altar, which is the center of religious activity, where sacrifices are made and prayers to the gods are offered. So she is very central to the kind of functioning of the city-state and individual households. Now Hermes, on the other hand, he's the Roman Mercury. He's typically seen as a messenger god, and he is depicted in iconography in a variety of ways. Sometimes he's old, sometimes he's young, sometimes he has a beard, sometimes he's clean shaven. Sometimes he's depicted in human form, sometimes it's simply a more abstract sort of statue. And we know that in the ancient Mediterranean, there were piles of stones known as Hermes, which could be found on the sides of roads and at crossroads. And passers-by would add stones to this pile as a means of demarcating boundaries. And eventually some of these stone piles, or Hermes hills, were eventually replaced by more formal statues. So we start to see Hermes function as a kind of god associated with boundaries and limits. And these statues often depicted a bearded man's head and an erect phallus. In Greek, this is known as an ithyphallic representation. But this sort of imagery is only marginally connected to fertility, because Hermes is a god of luck and good fortune. And the phallus, which was a fairly commonplace icon in the ancient world, is often interpreted as a charm against evil, what's known as an apotropaic charm. So in this function, he serves as protector of flocks and fields. These Hermes statues could also be found outside of residences, and one of his titles is somewhat mysterious. Kunankes, the dog strangler. This is somewhat difficult to explain, but perhaps relates to Hermes' ability to evade guard dogs as he moves from place to place. One of Hermes' offspring is the god Pan. This is a half goat, half man figure who is also found in the countryside and who similarly is portrayed in these ithyphallic iconographic terms. In fact, Pan gives us our word panic, which he causes in flocks and armies. Hermes is also a patron of herdsmen as he dwells at the edges of civilization, and this represents an earlier form of nomadic pastoral life, a world in which cattle raiding would have been commonplace. But Hermes is primarily a messenger. In many myth stories, he's the conveyor of information from gods to human beings. Famously, his winged sandals give him great speed as he travels from place to place on perilous journeys throughout the Greco-Roman world. And in fact, Hermes was a patron of those who were on journeys. In the ancient world, traveling was fairly dangerous. Robbers and bandits were commonplace. And we read many accounts in ancient literature of just how unsafe it was to be on the road without appropriate protection. Hermes can also move invisibly and without sound. He's a kind of divine spy. And in his travel aspect, this connects him with the greatest of journeys, that is to the underworld. So he can serve as an escort to people who are headed to the realm of the dead. As I mentioned earlier, he's also what can be called a liminal deity. He is one who crosses and transgresses boundaries. He moves between worlds and between separated spaces. He himself was honored along with Dionysus in an important Athenian festival of flowers known as the Anthesteria. This was a springtime festival involving the drinking of new wine and the banishing of the spirits of the dead. And like Dionysus, Hermes is depicted either as an older man or as a youth. So those two deities share that sort of dual imagery. And in this way, he is connected with maturity and the passage into adulthood. He was also involved in many athletics festivals in which young Greek men participated in. According to the myths, he slew a great multi-eyed giant named Argos, thus the title Argrophantes. And in his many movements, he carries with him the herald's staff, the Kerukion. This is a sacred symbol of messengers. And as a messenger, his task is often establishing successful communication with strangers and enemies. Hermes is also known as an interpreter. Not only does this is one of his functions of conveying information, he is known as the word hermeneus refers to an interpreter, which gives us the English term hermeneutics. This is the methodology of interpretation of, say, a particular text. Now, in a modern context, Hermes is often cited in relation to this notion of archetypes. And this idea of the archetype in a psychological sense is traced back to the psychologist Carl Jung, who developed this idea of the collective unconscious. He speculated based on his conversations with many patients and discussions of their dreams, as well as his studies of various religious and mythological traditions, that Jung believed that deeply embedded in the human psyche was a kind of set of patterns that result in similar images and characters and storylines that emerge throughout different myth stories found across the world and through time. And Jung and those who followed this analysis identified particular archetype figures like the hero or the sage or the great mother. The idea of the hero's journey, which we'll talk about in a later class, is closely connected to this Jungian analysis. But one of these archetype figures is the trickster. This is one that has been identified as present in numerous mythological cultures as a figure that is, boundary crossing, that transmits information, and that is a kind of disruptive, shape-shifting, dynamic figure. Sometimes serving as an anti-hero in a narrative, or a kind of rebel. And regardless of what you think of Jung and his theories, he has had an enormous impact on the way that mythology has been read and interpreted throughout the 20th century, especially from a comparative perspective, as a number of authors have tried to build on those ideas in the attempt to establish a kind of universal code for understanding myths around the world. Now, in the textbook, we have a reading from the author Lewis Hyde related to this idea of the trickster. And Hyde looks at different forms and manifestations of Hermes, distinguishing between the light and the dark Hermes. The dark Hermes is a kind of enchanter who moves in the world of sleep, is associated with dreams and mythology, whereas the light Hermes is a disenchanter, someone who awakens and illuminates. So it's not uncommon for mythological figures like this to have a kind of ambivalent multiplicity in the ways that they are manifest. But Hermes effortlessly moves from one realm to another as he guides people through various states of being. So within Hermes himself, there's a kind of structural duality where he both makes known what is hidden and hides what is known. So this is part of his function as someone who negotiates the barriers between various states of existence. He is a guardian, a messenger, and an interpreter who walks sort of on the edge of light and darkness. So Hyde provides a very interesting kind of holistic reading of the figure of Hermes based on different sources and traditions. Now, Hermes, like many of these ancient deities, has a long history of reception, and there's been many reimaginings and transformations of Hermes that have taken place over the centuries. So in the next part of this module, we will look at how Hermes, who is by nature a kind of shape-shifting deity, has evolved over time as he's been given other qualities and characteristics, and has played an important role in later philosophical and intellectual traditions.